Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, still wrapped in a pandemic, very sadly, still surging in many parts of the world, including the United States, even as multiple vaccines are emerging. We've had a session on here recently on the importance of not taking that as a moment of euphoria because there's so much danger in these coming months before the vaccine spreads and is efficacious. And there's so much danger of taking our eyes off the long ball, which is that ecology and the human interface with undeveloped ecosystems right now is going to generate more pandemic risk going forward. So we can't just think magically, okay, we're over this. Today, we're going to talk about, on our Thriving Online session, these Monday sessions are about how to build skills and spread techniques to thrive in this online space that we're all in right now. We're going to talk with three wonderful practitioners, authors, scientists who are dug in on how do you connect with that living world outside the human experience. And we're going to sort of challenge ourselves to think about ways to build that efficacy into the online space. I keep wondering, in the Zoomified world, here we're on StreamYard, but it's the same thing. What can we do? This isn't going to go away magically either, kind of like the vaccine solving the pandemic problem. So we'll be communicating a lot more online. And there's great things about it. Like we're all connecting from a distance. And I could have one of my friends in Bangladesh or in Zambia on here as well, if the time was right. So what do we do to build efficacy online by doing stuff offline? And today you're going to hear from Karen Romano-Young, who is a doodle bugger, self-described. She's a science illustrator and author who's got a string of books. You'll see some of those in a few minutes. She has a technique for journaling in a visual way that I think feels to me like one of those great hybrid ways to translate what you're seeing in the world, whether it's on a science expedition or in nature, and then conveying that online as well, perhaps. Richard Louv, who really pioneered, as far as I know, I mean, I shouldn't say that. There's hundreds of years from Thoreau and even earlier writers and naturalists and scientists who said, get out into the natural world to understand ourselves. But Richard Louv, with his first book, you'll see that in a minute, really nailed down this idea that leaving children inside is a terrible waste of potential. And we're losing so much by the stuff we don't do in nature. Right now, our local school here, with a private school, has canopies set up in the schoolyard. They've been teaching outside as much as they can in this resumed, in sort of a hybrid teaching model. And that was a normal thing. There are German kindergartens that teach outside. Paul Greenberg, who I got to know through his Fishy, I don't know if that was your first book, Paul, but your For Fish was a landmark book on, again, humans and nature exploiting the fish that really founded some big parts of our societies as we understood them. And now you have a new book out about taking that phone and putting it away. We'll learn about that. And Angelica Patterson, who's a botanist with a climate focus here at the Earth Institute, and she also works at Black Rock Forest, not too far from where I'm sitting in the Hudson River Valley. Angelica Patterson, who goes by Colorful Sci Girl on Twitter and is really leading the charge in helping communities that have been disengaged from nature even more and also who you'll hear about this a little bit, who have been intimidated in a way because of the color of their skin or other aspects of their existence from getting into communities that are sort of white historically. So Angie, it's great to have you here too.
Thank you.
And I can't wait to get started. So let's get going. This is the online environment, it's a pretty screwed up place, not even accounting for your screen time talking to other people, but we're just immersed in misinformation, disinformation, yelling, you name it. I stuck in there. I don't know if anyone can see Edvard Munch's The Scream. I plunked that into this Google search just for fun. And it just feels like screaming is one of the ways to react to this. And crying is another one. But I want to take us. So here, my thinking about this idea of the offline experience, online experience, getting wet, and then conveying that wetness in ways that might not be on a beach. I had this moment way back in, I think it was 2008. My son, who's now 22, was not yet 10. We were visiting his grandparents in Florida, and went for a little row down a channel in a very suburban part of Florida, hardly any green stuff left. And he held my video camera, and he made a little documentary. This is not even 2 minutes, so let's watch this to see, and hopefully you can hear it. We'll find out in a second. Thumbs up if you hear it, the birds.
Good morning. We're in Stuart, Florida. It's April 22nd, Earth Day. It's like the 38th Earth Day. And I'm rowing with my son Jack to go see some birds that we saw yesterday up a little mangrove creek here in the middle of Florida-style suburban sprawl.
I love his camera technique.
It's a lot of houses on a lot of little waterways.
He's gotten a lot better.
Nature is kind of interesting. It still fills in the blanks here. You go up these little creeks and pretty quickly you feel like you're not in the middle of a big suburban style, densely populated development.
This is close up in the mangroves. See if we can spot any animals. Whoa, there it goes. Well, that was amazing. Looked like a statue.
First spot.
Yep.
Let's see what else is coming.
Where we saw tricolored heron babies. Let's see if we can spot them again.
Oh, here.
Those are the babies. Oh, yes, there they are. There they are. Move back, move back.
Get out of the way, Dad. Get out of the way.
Just saw one. Move over a little. I can't see it. Can't see it. Just move in like that. Hello, little birdies.
And at this point, I'm not seeing
Yes,
anything.
it's on the camera. That's a baby tricolored heron. They are cute.
So that was like so mind-blowing. And what was interesting about it, let me stop it, sorry, was, well, several things were interesting. He saw stuff that I couldn't see at all in those bushes with his little young eyes. And it stuck with him. He, you know, I was doing my blog, .earth, and we put together a little film. You know, he helped me edit it a little bit, and we put it online. It got some thousands of views, not viral or anything. And he's gone on for a variety of reasons to have a career. He's just starting now, delayed by COVID-19, a career in film and TV. He went to BU and graduated a year ago. And I don't know how much of this experience led to that, but I'm sure it was part of it. And so my hypothesis is there's a hybrid path here, that we can, there's something, you know, one of the most primordial parts of the human experience is sharing stories, right? I went out and I saw something sitting by the fire. And now we have that potential for kids to sort of do that thing through their thing. So that I'm going to challenge the idea that it's all about getting offline. I think there's a way to do both. And let's get into that a little bit. And I thank you again all for being here this morning. And Paul, just before we get to the slides, could you just describe briefly your journey to nature and then conveying that to others? How did that become what you do?
Well, I should, first of all, in reference to sons, I'm now camped out in my son's room because it's the only place with a good Wi-Fi signal. But you can see various sun paraphernalia behind me, including the mountains we climbed in the Adirondacks over the years. But I digress. I would say actually a lot of it was being the child of a nature-loving person. My mother was just a huge lover of the Audubon. She was one of the, as a college student, she did some of the initial studies of peregrine falcons before the DDT news broke. And so she was actually finding peregrine nests with broken eggs in them. So she inspired me and got me going out and doing owl prowls with the Audubon Society and all those kind of things. But weirdly, like, I got closer to nature through fishing and through actually hunting fish and sometimes killing them. So in a way, you know, we all rebel against our parents. And in my case, my initial thing wasn't necessarily to seek out and see, it was to seek out and catch and eat. But anyway, as I grew older, you know, your feeling about killing and about getting involved in those kinds of damaging things to nature, that starts to mellow. And a certain point, I was writing for different magazines and newspapers, and I started writing sort of think pieces about fishing. I worked for the Boston Globe, and I did a piece about striped bass and bluefish, and why is it that when two similar fish coincide, we as humans decide one is better and the other is worse. And that led to a whole chain of other stories about fish and fishing, and then eventually the book For Fish. And I followed that up with 2 other books, which I call my marine trilogy. But I don't know if that gets to your initial question, Andy, or should I continue on?
That's good. And actually, you know, let's do a little quick round here before we get into the heart of things. How each of you became that interface between science and the natural world and the rest of the world. Maybe Karen. And where are you in the world? I'm trying to remember where you are, Karen.
I'm in Connecticut.
In Connecticut, right. Mm-hmm. So what was, how did that all come about in a quick sketch?
There was also murder of fish involved.
For me too,
my mother threw us out of the house. There was no question of, you know, go outside and be illuminated. It was get out of the house. And we were out in the neighborhood, and there was a river and ponds. And I was walking around in the river one day in March because I was trying to see how much cold I could endure. This is my own little scientific experiment. And I should back up and say I didn't have any formal science education until I was in 6th grade. So I was about 9 at this point, and I was walking around in the river, and a woman across the river started screaming at me to stop, because with every step I was taking, I was murdering 1,000 fish. And I pointed out to me that the fish was full of fish eggs, and that this was where they were, you know, going to hatch. And I had no idea until she said, well, come over and I'll show you the water under a microscope. I'd never seen a microscope. I'd never seen eggs. And that was a night when I went home and said to everybody around the dinner table, okay, let me tell you a few really cool things. My introduction to science was just carried on in that way, where everything that I knew came from the natural world, not from a formal setting at all. And I've carried that into my experience as a children's book writer, and also as a science communicator. I'm always coming from the standpoint of somebody who doesn't know anything going into an area of new knowledge.
That what you just said about microscopes really excited me, because there's this at Columbia 10 years ago, people at this, I think it was the Zuckerman lab or somewhere, they started what's called a biobus. They realized that kids in many neighborhoods in New York City are never going to see a science lab, so they put a lab in a bus.
Oh, wow.
It has a bunch of microscopes, and they're projecting the stuff in the screen, and they can't do that right now, obviously. But it's really opened kids' eyes. Something about that aspect, magnification, is really powerful.
Yeah.
But there's so much more. So Richard, I remember from reading. It's not No Child. Oh my God, what's the title of your first book?
Last Child in the Woods.
Last Child in the Woods, right? There's a section in there where you describe how this came about. But can you just sort of say what led you to that? You're a journalist, right? You're not a child psychologist or a biologist. So what was your path in a quick sketch?
Yeah, I like to say I actually got a BS in journalism.
Which is kind of a BS and BS sometimes.
Yeah, you don't do it right.
I spent most of my, it seemed like most of my boyhood in the woods and in the fields behind our house. We lived on the edge of suburban Kansas City. I could be gone. I mean, my dog, my parents often didn't know where I was, but my dog always did. And my mother would know when I was up to no good, because the dog would show up. He'd go home. And I really found something bigger there than my parents. I was lucky. I had parents who loved nature, introduced it to me. But my father had some severe mental health problems. So the woods really became a window into another world. And I had such a sense of ownership of those woods that I think I pulled out hundreds of survey stakes that I knew had something to do with bulldozers that were taking out other woods. I had a big stack behind the edge. I don't know if you remember, but they made great swords. And I think I held them off for a while, but those woods are still in my heart.
That's so interesting.
The bulldozers did come, but
when you had a conversation with your kids where you realized your son or sons, I can't remember, didn't have that understanding or that connection. Is that right?
Well, they did.
Oh.
I agreed with Matthew about that. But now he was saying, I would start talking about building tree houses, things that in our neighborhoods, at least, you could go down into the canyons and stuff, but God help you if you built a tree house. The community association Nazi police.
Oh, I see. Right.
So I really listened to him though, and today he's really a nature guy. He was a fly fishing guide on Kodiak, Alaska, right?
Oh, wow.
So he and with bears, and he knows what he's doing.
Wow. And then you started reporting on this issue. You wrote the book, so we'll get into that a little more in a minute. But that's an interesting beginning. I do recall when I was 12 or 13, we moved in Rhode Island from one suburban development to another. And I liked that there were woods in the back. I could actually walk through the woods, across the field to the Hunt River. It was right behind the supermarket. In fact, there were like tossed supermarket carts, in the river. But there was a willow tree there that I could sit under, and I could be anywhere in the world, And I gave you that. And one day there was a bulldozer parked in those woods. And I thought, I got righteously pissed off. I actually, I've invented this recently. I wrote a death threat. I wrote a note. I scribbled a death threat on the note and put it on the bulldozer seat. I think it was like a kid style death threat. He who despoils these woods will rot in hell or something. So I had that same sense. But later, it was only much later in life that I started to realize, there was a bulldozer that had cleared the place for where my house was built. And I hadn't really absorbed that at that time. So
can I add, I ran into a developer years later when I was on book tour, and I told that story about pulling out survey stakes. He came up to me and he said, you would have been a lot more effective if you'd simply moved the stakes around.
That's so true.
Yeah, keep that in mind. And Angie, briefly, your sense of what drew you to botany, and also not just to botany, but you do education and outreach.
Yeah, there's so many parallels to everyone's story here. One of my favorite trees is a willow tree as well. I was born in North Carolina, and we had like several willow trees in the backyard, and I would just sit under them. And I remember vividly just the majestic tree, above me. And later on moved to Pennsylvania when I was around 5 years old. And growing up there in a rural area, my sister and I we had maybe an acre of land, but we were surrounded by woods, and we would go and go, try to build a log cabin or, try to make two little streams connect. It was just fun to be able to go out and play. And I think that those experiences really, really helped spark my curiosity of the natural world. And I too did eventually murder fish as well in my training. So, but I did some work exploring the evacuation rates of Chinook salmon, which is the fancy way of saying how fast did fish poop different types of food. But just all those different types of experiences add up. And you know, my goal is to kind of inspire other kids, young adults to experience the types of things that I did, and really, you know, take ownership and become advocates of the land.
And we'll get to your Twittering and the like also in a few minutes. But that's a good sort of a starting point for this deeper round of this deeper discussion. Let me get back into a couple of slides so Paul can talk about this new book about turning off your phone. Hold on one second while I remember how to do this.
While you're setting it up, I will say one thing that that goes back to all this thing. I had the same experience of bulldozers in the woods and everything, but how many of you have gone back on Google Earth and found your house and see where, how much is developed around it? All my favorite house of the many houses that my divorced mother moved us to is surrounded by giant McMansions and swimming pools and tennis courts now.
Yeah, it's amazing. So let's see, here we go.
You good to go?
Yeah, so Paul, we should be seeing slides there now. A Goodbye Phone, Hello World is the title of your short new book. It's a very sweet little essay on this theme, and with I think about 60 tips on what to do with the time you might save by not doom scrolling, which is not exactly a productive activity. That it's something we all spend a lot of time at. So let me click forward here a little bit.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, this whole book came about because after doing all the science reporting and all this time out in the field, I actually started to notice that more and more the people I was interviewing and talking to and getting involved with, while they were often out in the woods or doing these things, they would inevitably turn to their phone. And so I started adding up the amount of time that the average American spends on their phone. And it's about 4 hours a day, 2 waking months out of every year, more than a year over a decade. The way the book begins is the iPhone, my son was born in 2006. The iPhone was born in 2007, and they've been competing with my attention ever since. So the book is, in a way, it was written pre-COVID, though a lot of the stuff really resonates, and especially now as we're, as you said, Andy, at the top, heading hopefully towards a vaccine, I think we're going to have to not only inoculate ourselves against the virus, we're going to have to inoculate ourselves against screens. And we really need to take stock of all of this time we spent on screens. So, you know, as this slide here is saying, 4 hours on their phone every day, our phones every day, but look at what we were actually doing. Over 4 years, Americans have spent 173 million hours reading about Trump on their phones. Now, you might say, oh, well, they're reading about him everywhere. No, it turns out we're reading about Trump on our phones. We read about Trump twice as much as on our laptops. So the phone and Trump and distraction is exactly tied up. And when we talk about this next generation of next period of time where we have to decenter Trump, I think we really also need to kind of think about decentering our phones. So to a large degree, oops, sorry, I lost my headphone. So to a large degree, the book is really about what could you do with those 1,400 hours a year. And it tries to be whimsical, but it also tries to be somewhat practical. Different things, Andy, if you want to advance, you know, you could, for example, if you took all the time that you spent on the world champions distance cyclist actually circumnavigated the landmass of the globe in the amount of time that the average American spends on their phone in a year. So imagine you could circumnavigate the globe. I mean, the average person probably couldn't do it, but you could get halfway. And I think, you know, again, these are whimsical things, and there are more practical things in the book. But I also just really like the art, and I wanted to include this slide. It's a great artist named Emiliano Ponzi from Italy, and we had a really fun time working on it. But
I did just briefly. I did a session with Paul Salopek on here recently, who is the ultimate slow journalist. He's walking 21,000 miles over 10 years.
Oh man.
And he's in Myanmar stuck because of the pandemic. So we spent an hour on the show, and it was fantastic to hear him.
So he must have walked around and around in Myanmar.
Yeah, I guess.
He really knows Myanmar now.
He's an extraordinary communicator.
But, you know, another sort of silly, whimsical thing that if a family of 4 were to get, you know, you can get these DIY or you get these human-powered drivetrains that will charge batteries. And so if the average family of 4 were to use their time on a smartphone, they would offset on an exercise bike 1.6% of the family's energy needs. And if all of humanity spent their smartphone time on just on a pedal bike, we could burn 200 billion pounds less of coal. So again, not everyone's going to go out and buy that one kind of thing, but I think it's kind of fun to think about.
I certainly need it.
And actually, in the book, there's instructions about how to get in touch with Bradley Whaley of Pedal Power Generators, and he can either help you get a he can sell you a drivetrain, or he can actually walk you through the DIY aspect of building one for your house. So that's on my agenda. We were talking about acres of land that we remember for our house. I just bought a single acre of land in the Adirondacks for money. I'm thinking about it called 1 acre, and it might take some of this postulations further down the line. What else could you do with these 1,400 hours? You could, Andy, if you don't mind, you could play catch with your child. I mean, you know, these are all things like, you know, I think we forget about these very simple things that we could be doing with our children, with our loved ones. Think about the act of playing catch. You're making eye contact. Think about how many young people don't want to make eye contact with you. You know, I don't know, Richard, and you're like looking at, you know, in your investigations of children and nature disorder, you know, nature deprivation disorder, like how much of just looking at people and looking at things instead of being like this and like this and like this. But catch, you have to engage, and you look at your father or your mother, who you're playing with. And anyway, 1,400 hours, you could throw a ball back and forth about 8,000 miles over the time. So I think that's 3 times back and forth across the United States.
Amazing.
But another thing that you could also do is to sort of think about more contemplative things. And I think, again, what I think the phone does to us is it limits our frame of vision, and it limits our ability, to be exposed to awe, which I think is really, really critical to both human satisfaction and also to our engagement with the planet. And that just, I quote here, a 2003 UC Irvine study found that people who experienced vastness and awe expanded their worldview and tended to forego strict self-interest to improve the welfare of others. Research subjects also felt they had more time available, were less impatient, and preferred experiences over material products. And so one of the sort of practical solutions I throw into the book on this count is you could look at the night sky, and I give the access information for the Dark Sky Project, which has a listing of all the dark sky reserves around the world. So things like that. There's a lot more technical stuff that we can get in. If there are questions on the chat about sort of day-to-day things that you can do to keep off of your phone, we can go into it, but I don't want to take other people's time. But that's sort of, you know, what the book is kind of trying to do. But I'd love to hear people's feedback and to talk more about it.
We'll brainstorm on this in a minute. And it's certainly come at a great time because, as I said, Zoom time and screen time is much more of what we're doing, whether we want to or not. And finding ways to recharge offline so you can get back online is certainly one of those paths forward. Hold on 1 second. So back to you, Richard Louv. I was curious to ask you, the first book came out when?
2005.
Right. And my wife is in environmental education, science education, and she and I both cherish that moment because we think about this a lot, not just for our own kids. So how have things played out? You know, it was, I'm not sure technically a bestseller, but it's had many international editions. It spawned the Children in Nature Network, which is a very active interface with classrooms and communities all around the world. And how are we doing?
Well, first, you know, I thought for a long time I was going to get a T-shirt that said "Who knew," because there was so much activity after the book came. I had no clue that it would touch a nerve like it did, and it was a bestseller. Thank God. And I imagined a movement in the next to the last chapter. I'd worked with a guy named Mike Perchak, who was one of the big leaders in the anti-smoking movement, and I asked him, if you could imagine a movement to connect kids and their families and their communities in nature, what would it look like? And that much of that next to last chapter was just imagining that, and that was wishful thinking. But pretty soon it happened, and I was being asked all the time, "What do we do now, buddy?" Great. And so fortunately, some really great people came to my rescue and formed the Children of Nature Network, which is a network of all kinds of people around the world that are working in schools and neighborhoods, developers, all kinds of folks, pediatricians that are working to connect kids to nature. Over time, a couple things happen. One is that, I'm looking at either, I think it's a Cooper's hawk. It's about 3 feet outside my window. I've never seen that. Great.
You can't swivel your screen.
I got to look that up. Make sure.
That's great.
Anyhow, where was I?
You were distracted by nature instead of distracted by screen. I like that.
Well, pediatricians now around the country and overseas too are prescribing nature. All kinds of professionals now have incorporated not only environmental educators, but there's been a lot of progress in that. There are regional campaigns all over the country and now around the world. I think there's 7 states in the country of Australia. 4 of them now have big campaigns to get kids outdoors. I've been there. Brazil launched a national campaign to connect kids. Brazil, with all that nature, the Amazon, but they've got nature deficit disorder too. And so that's been great. Another great thing has been that when I wrote Last Child, there were about 6 studies that I felt comfortable citing, both on the deficit. There weren't very many on the deficit, but mainly on the benefits, which were more important studies to cognitive health, to physical health, to psychological health. It had been virtually ignored by the academic world. This huge thing in our lives. How could we study everything else and how it affects children's health and ours, but nature experience had been pretty much neglected. There were a few pioneers. Today, if you go to the Children Nature Network, to the research library that we've built there, independently written abstracts of over 1,000 studies, and it's continuing to grow 15, 20 studies a month from somewhere in the world. And they point in the same direction, which is this is fundamental to children's development and to ours throughout our lives.
Fantastic. Well, again, congratulations on really finding that thing that I think everyone was aching for, or certainly the idea seems so quote unquote natural.
Well, there were a lot of people working on this. I mean, there was, but they weren't getting the respect they deserved. So that I like to think that the book helped get them a little more respect.
I was recently, feels like ages ago, but I think it was just last year, I was on a panel with a woman from Arizona State, I believe, who had been working in prisons, studying prisons and psychology, and they did this isn't exactly what you're talking about because it's virtual, but they installed some images, some screens in the solitary confinement area with views of nature. And an interesting thing happened. The guards in the prison said, "We want that too." and there was a lot of resistance to this initially because the prison culture, politics around prisons is they should be punished, right? They shouldn't be allowed to see anything that's quote unquote fun. But when it became something that even the prison, the people running the prison wanted, then it changed the dynamic, which is really interesting. And Angie, let's go to you, and let me just bring up a slide here. As I said earlier, you're very active on Twitter, and I would like to get a sense from you of how that came up to be part of what you're doing. I know you're the youngest person here, I would imagine, and so you came up. I'm not sure if you're a digital native. Were you born? I don't want to get into ages, but I think you're closest to the digital age.
Yeah, I mean, I'm technically a millennial, I think, but I still grew up reading books, physical books. I didn't grow up with an iPad in my hand. So I think I'm like the last generation to do that. But yeah, just through this past summer, kind of jumping onto the social campaigns to bring awareness of that, Black scientists actually exist in the world, and that we are active and we are outdoors, really prompted me to get involved with the Black Botanist Week, Black in Nature. And so I thought Twitter was the perfect platform to do so. And it opened my eyes and network, to all these people who are doing the same. And that's when I really communicated about my research, studying plants, how climate is impacting how plants are responding to it. And that kind of took off, and, got a lot of people enthusiastic about reading more about it and what they can do about it. And even just generally, my journey of how I became a scientist, which is, hearing diverse narratives around that is, not really, not as available as it used, as it is now. But yeah, that's how I kind of started.
I'm showing the Black in Nature hashtag, and there's a friend of mine, Ayana Johnson.
Oh yes, I know Ayana.
Tweeting recently. She's a marine scientist who has developed an incredible presence as a communicator on around climate and the ocean futures. So that world is a place to connect field work with the again, the digital arena. And let me just stop sharing for a second, and then I want to show you. Let me just see. I'm just going to pull this up so we can get it high resolution. Talk about what do you do at Black Rock Forest? I showed earlier that you work there too.
Yeah. So I am the master science educator at Black Rock, and we have about 20 or so member institutions that come and use the forest resources for teaching, learning, exploring, research, and we have thousands of students in classrooms come every year, to learn all different aspects of forest ecology. And so, I'm the liaison, so to speak, between the forest and these schools and institutions, and now coming up with ways more on the technology side to connect students to the forest, or bring the slice of the forest to them virtually, because of the times that we have now. So we've been doing, making videos. We set up our YouTube channel, started video recording lessons that they would experience if they were here. And this was fun, kind of recording these 360-degree virtual hikes along our trails. And it's
really cool, because for those who are online, you can literally look around.
You can literally look around.
Quote unquote, as you quote unquote are kind of walking, you can say, wow, what was that over there?
Yeah, and it's just a different stimulus, right? Like, I mean, it's one thing, especially, to be in the forest and to breathe the air and to feel the earth beneath your feet. But a lot of conversation has been centered around, how can we bring the forest to people who don't have access to it? And, whether they're disabled or they don't have the means to visit a green space, if they're in urban areas. And so we took the plunge and bought a 360 GoPro and decided to record a couple hikes to some really beautiful summits here at the forest. And it's silent. So the person who's watching the video can just hear the steps we're taking or look around. And I think in one of the videos, you can see a deer crossing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is super fun.
That's pretty cool. So this gets into that hybrid kind of approach where, not all of us live in a way that makes this easily accessed. And that feels, so you said that really all started this year, right?
It all, yeah.
And,
all of it started this year for sure. As a need, you know, that the educators really wanted. You know, we would usually get a class to come up and they would stay overnight and do a hike, and some of them a mindfulness hike, you know, to really center themselves and kind of bring attention to that nature deficit. And but they couldn't come this year, and so we tried to compensate by providing something for them.
That reminds me also of Skype a Scientist, which the first session I did here during lockdown was with Sarah McNulty, a marine biologist who studies squid mostly, who was one of the people 2 or 3, maybe it was longer ago now, 4 years, who started the idea of using Twitter and a hashtag Skype a Scientist to basically put up your hand and say, hey, I'm a marine biologist. I study squid. Do you want me to come to your classroom? Quote unquote. And they were doing that successfully already in this pre-COVID world and got into overdrive, obviously, now. I don't know if you're part of that or if anyone else has dealt with that, but it feels like it is not perfect. You're not getting wet. You're not getting muddy.
Right.
Not turning over the rock. You're not killing fish.
Right. That's the part. We're really hoping that we can, you know, get more classrooms. We'll be in a spot where we can get students, public, you know, back into nature, because there's no replacement, you know, for that.
There is not. No, it's everything else is a compromise. Well, we'll talk about that though. It's one other aspect of it that might be interesting. So let me go back to those slides, and we're going to get to Karen and techniques. So this is more like practices that can make a difference. Hold on, I'll get the right thing. There we go. It's fun being your own producer. So Karen, again, you explained how you kind of got into this field, and here you've gone on many expeditions at sea. I don't know whether you need anti-seasickness pills or the like, but it must be hard to focus on drawing when you're on a ship, especially in the Southern Ocean. But you've done amazing work here. You've, again, these books, you had the Antarctic Log, I think it's called, which was a running diary, sort of a public diary from one of the expeditions. So talk about that practice a little bit. Did you grow up as an artist, or was that part of your life before this, or did you kind of come to that?
Well, I always like to draw, and I'll get back to that in a minute. I did just want to say to Angie, I've been sitting here with the screen on the small screen, and when you put the video on, I just had to click on the big screen. I'm sitting here looking at it, snow falling, and then I was in the middle of the summer in the green woods, and I felt that green forest bath kind of come over you.
Great.
So there's really something to that. I was talking about my mom before, and she not only threw us out of the house all the time, but she always said, if your brain is tired, you need to exercise your body, and vice versa. If your body's tired, you know, go read a book. And so I was encouraged when my brain got tired, which is something I'm always, you know, conscious of what's going on in my own head, and would go outside a lot. And as at the beginning, Andy, when you showed your video of your son with the herons, I loved it that he wound up being a creative person who made films of that, because I could see how you could just be out riding around on a boat in that environment that you said is sort of Florida suburbia and not feel engaged and just think this is boring. There's nothing here for me. But he had seen something that he wanted to share. And that has been my experience also. Like I said earlier, I didn't have a formal science education background. I had an education background, and I had a writing background, and I got a job early on writing for children for a magazine that covered everything. And it took me about 2 months to figure out that the only people I really wanted to talk about or talk to were the scientists, because they had an exciting time. But without a science background, how was I going to get involved in all of that? Who did I think I was a question I got a lot of the time. And my answer has been, I think I'm a person who is really interested, even though I don't have the background that you might think that I require. I've learned a lot on my feet. As you can see me sitting here drawing, this is aboard the JOIDES Resolution, which is a research drilling ship that was in Antarctica in 2019. And I was on it as a science communicator. So I'm in the core lab where they're bringing up sediment cores from under the ocean floor that are going to help them figure out the history of the Amundsen Sea Basin, which is where the Thwaites Glacier is flowing into, and so much vulnerability there. So I did not have any idea what I was seeing. I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I didn't have any idea what the intelligent questions were to ask. So I sat off to the side and I drew. And then afterwards, when the drawing was done, I could go around to all these different scientists, like the guy on the left in the comic, and say, "What were you doing?" And he would explain to me that he was measuring the magnetism of the sediment that came up, and told me why. And it was just a conversation opener. And a lot of what I do has been as a way to open conversations so that people see, A, that I can contribute something to that the public will be able to understand, and that might open doors to more people being interested in their work. And then it'll allow them to kind of tell me something about it that I can use to tell the story.
It's just great. And let's get to the next slide because I want to show your process a little bit here. Hold on.
Okay. Okay, so Doodlebug is what started all of this. I have always been a doodler. And when I was a kid in school, I got in trouble all the time for it. But I knew that there was something to it. I kept on doing it. And after school, I would go and steal my crumpled up pages of art out of the teacher's garbage can and take them home with me and keep them. And when I got older and was really looking for a story to tell for kids, I told this story about a girl who, in my time, I don't think we knew what ADD was. We just knew that you needed to have your hands busy all the time, or maybe you were a fidgety kid, or somebody who couldn't sit still, or somebody who had ants in their pants. That was me. And I knew that if I drew, that I behaved better. And that's what we're dealing with the girl who's in this book, who figures out that doodling helps her stay in the room. And the more that I learned about this, the more I realized that it is a real thing.
The doodling helps her stay in the room.
Yes. She wants to stay in the room. She wants to pay attention. She wants to be involved. She's not just staring out the window, zoning out. She's doing something that allows her to focus.
And then you're doing something with the result here, which is sort of interesting too. Let me just click here. This video, which is online at YouTube, describes how to doodle. And I'm going to take. Sorry. I'm going to silence it so you can kind of describe what's going on. But,
yeah. So when I did Doodlebug, I just had a sketchbook and drew the story at the same time as I was writing it all by hand in a sketchbook. And ultimately, what wound up happening was they scanned the sketchbook, and that is what became the book. So it is all handwritten and all hand-drawn. There you go. I think it's going to zoom in and show you. This is the first page, and I didn't know really what I was doing. And one of the points that I make in this video is that if you see an elaborate drawing, you'll know that I didn't know what came next in the story. So stopped and drew this thing, and you know, when you draw, your mind does keep on staying focused, and it would allow me to come up with the next part of the story. I do journaling this way also, and this is what led me to, I took this with me when I went to sea and began my science comics when I was in the Arctic Ocean on a different research ship, and heard a sad story about climate change and walrus that I didn't know how to tell in just text. So I drew it instead. And that it changed everything. For one thing, it made it easier for people to read about a sad story, as well as making it easier for me to tell. And I really began exploring what happens when you draw something, any kind of a story. But I take it into nature also. Anytime I am unsure of what I'm seeing, not just a complicated lab on an ocean-going vessel, but maybe an insect or a simple machine that I don't understand how it works or what I'm looking at. If I draw it, I understand more about it. And it gives me a stepping off point to asking questions of experts.
It's so interesting. One of my intimidations in drawing is committing to the page. But it's a little bit like a lot of people are very intimidated by writing, looking at the blank page, because you're afraid. Although, especially in the old days when you were writing in ink, you can't erase it and go back and start over again. But you seem to just go forward, which is really cool, which is sort of a courageous act in a way.
It's not that I don't screw up, and I'm a devoted fan of Photoshop, but I didn't use it much in this in this book. I do a lot of writing longhand, and then also the drawing. I worked with an educator named Elspeth Sladden, who worked with kids who had a lot of trouble with handwriting and with reading and writing, but they were good at math and science. And she told me about a study that they did that proved that if you are using your hands, you're accessing different parts of your brain, even if you're just telling the same story. And that has stayed with me. I can feel that. I can feel different parts of my brain when I'm working with my hands than on the keyboard.
That's so interesting. Now, I actually want to ask everyone else here. I don't know, Paul or Richard or Angie. There are a lot of Angie. There are a lot of botanists who do field journals who are very carefully noting dimensions of things, and famously Darwin and everybody else did a lot of drawing. Are you a digital person when it comes to that stuff, or are you using a pad?
Yeah, I was quote unquote trained or have experience with the pen on paper type of technique. And it's very interesting, right? Because you can totally sketch on iPads now and do some professional, illustrations and things like that. But going back to analog, right? There's something different about it. And like you mentioned before, you can make mistakes and it's not as easy to erase, but that's part of the process. You go with the flow. And yeah, nature journaling is definitely a technique to teach students how to just observe, teach kids how to observe, how to, what are they seeing? How do they interpret it? So it's a value for sure.
I think, Andy, and also Karen, when you were talking about sort of documenting exploration, I think, also what Angie's saying, I think that one of the problems with the digital age when it comes to science and nature is that it cuts out this critical tactile moment when you as a young scientist emerging actually physically engage with the natural world. And I think, I don't know about it. I'm sure, I have a feeling everybody on this call kind of wishes that their professional life could have been spent like in the golden age of computerless exploration, and being able to actually, oh my God, I was just reading Louis Menand's Metaphysical Club, and it sort of documents all those intellectuals around the time that Darwin was emerging and looking at all these things. And just the idea that you, with your two eyes, your two hands, could observe something and say something true and profound about the world without the academy weighing in. And you think about Darwin's education, he was like a failed cleric, right? I don't think he had any formal science education. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, that you could come to the table with a fresh pair of eyes, not necessarily through a website or whatever, but through the actual physical moment. I just think it's hugely valuable and hugely important and hugely humanizing.
And Richard, for you and for the Children of Nature Network, the website is incredibly rich with everything, guides and other websites and tools. What are the ways that kids can kind of take that being in nature, and make the most of it? How does that play out in the work that you've done?
Well, if we're talking, during pandemic, it's a little different than pre. I did want to mention, Karen, I love your doodling, and I was a hardcore doodler all the way. And my mother was a commercial artist, and I have her art desk downstairs that I spent hours and hours underneath as she drew.
That's interesting.
And I have to confess that I don't doodle. I mean, I really related to what you said about attention deficit disorder, because I say in one of the books that I'm convinced I would have been put on Ritalin, and that nature was my Ritalin.
Yes.
But I was the kid that was always doodling, always looking out the window at the trees. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't have seen that hawk a little while ago. So I really relate to that. I think there's a direct connection between art and our experience of nature. And I will confess that I don't doodle much anymore. And that's because I can't find a pen. I'm serious. I have to go look for a pen. And so you've reformed me. In terms of what you can do, I think nature journaling is a great thing. I wrote a piece recently about 10 things that kids can do, that families can do, anybody can do during the pandemic to connect with nature. One of the things that we've found is, and you've noticed this too, journalists certainly have, that the pandemic has actually hugely increased our awareness of nature. You know, sometimes you don't know what you got till it's gone, till you can't go to the park, and then there's a park I can't go to. And so there's a lot of interest now that wasn't there. We used to have to work really hard. I have to work really hard to say this is connected to your health. I don't have to do that now. And but at the same time, it's also illuminated the vast gaps, the inequities of, you know, when we look at urban design, you know, what about the kids that don't have a yard right outside? What do they do? So some of those 10, in addition to hoping that this reforms our urban design theories and that we incorporate biophilic design into cities, into schools, into where we live a lot more than we do now. You know, we can look out the window right now. I mean, I collected stories from people recently for a piece I wrote for the LA Times about how animals were helping them get through this thing. And sometimes it was their pets, and there's been a big run on shelters, dog shelter, you know, animal shelters, because people have to. We did that. We now have 2 cats.
Right.
Walk around hugging them because we are starved for hugging. But if you look out the window like I just did, you can still feel that sense of awe. And people would tell me that when I would ask them, what's getting you through, they would say, watching the animals, watching the birds outside the window. And they spoke of it with great eloquence and feeling that I'm not sure they would have used before the pandemic.
Richard, actually, I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you've been keeping up, but I was trying to do a session on here several months ago on outdoor education, meaning there are a number of schools like the one here in our village that have moved a lot, substantial amounts of the education on out literally outside. And I don't know if there's, among all the downsides of what's happened these past years, there's some sense that getting classroom, getting some of that learning outdoors has wider benefits. Is that something you're keeping track of?
There's a sense of that, but I'm not sure it's happening to the degree. I mean, Andy, you mentioned the school near you. Those are great schools. But, you know, my brother's a high school student in Northern California. He was told to go back to the classroom in early August. He walked in, this is, you know, in Fortuna, California, big nature area. He walked into the school. The desks were 3.5, 4 feet apart. There was no plan to get the kids outside in outdoor classrooms. Where I live now in Julian, ran into a guy that runs, I think it's the YMCA camp up there. He offered the school district here, his whole camp, which is 2 miles from the high school here, to bring them there for outdoor classrooms. He's never heard back from them. I think this is something that journalists have written about more than it is in reality during the pandemic. Yeah. And yet when you look at 1915, the tuberculosis pandemic, there were outdoor classrooms on the tops of New York skyscrapers, high-rise buildings. So it should be happening much more than it is, and we can go into why it isn't, but there's a number of reasons. I did want to say, though, that Andy, you kept using the word hybrid, and I think that's really important here, is that I've never ranted against technology. I've talked about the downside, as Paul has eloquently done. But there's a problem when we only talk about that, because
Hi, I'm Karen.
the minute that kids, adults are telling kids what they shouldn't be doing, kids want to do more of. So there's a practical reason for that. But also because obviously we're going to be more high tech. So the mantra that I've used for a long time is, the more high tech our lives become, the more nature we need. We need to amp up the amount of nature we get. But like it or not, we're going to be more high tech. And the hybrid mind is one of the ideas that I wrote about in the Nature Principle. Basically, we have to find some balance in our schools, and it's not there in the school, between the digital and the real. The best way I can describe the hybrid mind, I met a guy that teaches people how to become the pilots of cruise ships. And he said he gets two kinds of students. One kind grew up on couches playing video games and on their iPhones and all that. And he said that the other type of student grew up mainly outside, or a lot of outside experience, maybe in a farm area, maybe their parents hiked a lot. He said the students that grew up with video games and all of that electronically, they have a great talent that I need. I've got a lot of electronics on my ships. The other kind of student, he said, who grew up mainly outside, he said, they also have a great talent that I need. They can actually tell where the ship is. And he meant that viscerally. He meant that they have a sense of when the ship is too close to the dock. They have a sense of direction. He said his feeling was that the kids who'd grown up only electronically, or primarily that way, their spatial senses had not developed to the degree, and there's research that would support that. Now, the next thing he said was the most interesting. He said his ideal student would be a student who had both sets of abilities. In the virtual world and in the physical world, in the natural world. I think that should be one of the goals of education now.
You know, I completely agree, Richard. And I think what's really missing here is what you're saying about how there's no plan. There's no plan. You know, the school. We have our schools with doing their virtual kind of cobble together thing, but largely there's no plan for how children are going to get technology into their lives in the first place, and what they're going to be allowed to do and what they're not going to be allowed to do. Personally, I think no middle schooler should have access to a fully tricked out iPhone, because you need to, you know, before they're even conscious about how to sort one input from another, that you're going to flood them with everything all at once. Yeah. That to me is insane. And it exactly tips the scale against that person in nature that your captain is saying we need. So it's like, if there's nobody minding the shop of what's getting into their slipstream in the first place, then how are we going to get those kind of hybrid people in the first place? And
the irony is the big folks who run the tech world understand, they know this. Their kids are in nature schools, they're in outdoor classrooms.
That's right.
But they don't talk about that. They want to push their product, and they really, and there are a lot of good people there, but they really control the debate, at least up until now, about what the future of the classroom is going to look like.
That's, boy, yeah, I think you've hit on something really important here, that the tech world has the upper hand, in a sense, in many ways, both structurally in how the education systems are evolving towards smart screens and smart boards, and getting that actual offline. I love what Paul just said about there has to be these points of just offline experience, just navigating a forest. The Hudson Highlands Nature Museum across the river from where I live, where my wife used to be the education director, they have, even for toddlers, they created a space, they called it Grasshopper Grove. That's pretty much that. It's an area that's designed to be as safe as possible, but also muddy and with stuff that kids can examine. So they're kind of giving them a liberated moment that doesn't have a screen. And that seems really vital. Paul, you really hit on something valuable that comes right from your book, obviously, the idea of really putting down the phone. Because what I'm saying here in this slide is more on that, the general benefit of that hybrid approach is like iNaturalist, I think, is a fantastic tool for inquiry-based hiking. Essentially, like we have inquiry-based learning. If you're out there and you've got your phone and you see a species, you're really curious about it, you put it on there and you're part of a community, a global community that's comparing knowledge on that species. On Sunday, just yesterday, was that just yesterday? I was hiking with my wife, who's an environmental educator, and we had this amazing moment in up on the South Redoubt, where Lisa said, she looked down, she said, the ground is moving. I said, what are you talking about? She said, the ground is moving. And we looked closer and it was this. I took this video and it was just, I'll just play it again. It was, and it was only later that I looked online for, I was Googling for words like fleas, forest, leaves. And I know Angie knows the answer right away, and others probably here do too. It's springtails. So the online part taught me that these are super decomposers. They're a critical part of the ecosystem. There was one website that said there are like 100,000 per square meter in many instances, and that felt. And of course, I shared it on Twitter, which is kind of what I do. Somehow, in that instance, at least, having that dual capacity to take the image, sort of like my son back at age 9 of mangroves and the birds, felt like it gave us a richer possibility of examining that moment than if I had just been there. But I do totally embrace what Paul just said about yes, and also just be there. I'm not sure how that works out. I guess it just means we have to spend some more time in nature without devices.
Well, one thing that, a friend of mine who shows up in the book, a guy named David de Rothschild, said to me, this is a guy who didn't know how to sail and then built a boat out of plastic bottles and sailed it across the Pacific. But he said to me that one of the things we're really missing in child education now is the act of getting lost. Like, I'm just wondering, those of you who work with young people, it's very scary to get lost, right? And I'm sure you all in your moments being out in the woods have gotten lost. But remember the moment of finding yourself again and patting yourself on the back for finding yourself again. And I'm just wondering if anyone out there has any thoughts, like how do you, in this super, screen monitored, but also safety obsessed time, how do we give children the opportunity to be lost? I don't know.
I think that's such a great point. I remember, going into the woods and, having a compass in my hand, trying to figure out what is pointing where. But then, as I got older and meeting a group of students, they don't even know what a compass is. And they're used to just putting something in a GPS, right? But there's no reception in the woods. So yeah, you're guaranteed to get lost. And I think just, creating opportunities, for students to learn, to actually go out there, kind of make them jump 2 feet, into it. Say, you need to get here. I mean, I think that's what West Point cadets do. It's like, as part of their training, it's like, you're going out in the middle of the woods at night. You need to reach this destination. We gave you the tools. Here's a map. Go ahead and find it. But man, Richard, like you said, once you have both that technology and that analog skill, man, you just increased your value, to society in that level.
Boy, and everything you've been saying really reinforces the role of parents here. That, we can't rely on the schools to be the component that would have that level of getting lostness. That has to be a parental possibility.
It helps if you have a father who gets lost.
Yeah, right.
I said, no, we're not. We're just out there in right position.
I do think it's important to think about parents and teachers and to consider some tools that they can use, because they may not have the experiences themselves in the woods. And, what do I do? And to be able to say things like geocaching, or what's the other thing where you've got a map and you've got to run around and you're in a competition?
Orienteering.
Orienteering, yes. But I love iNaturalist, which you flashed past too, where you can go and find something like your springtails and then go back and put them into the database and find out who else saw them somewhere else. And maybe you don't have to completely cut off your connection with the wider world, but you can contribute. Citizen scientist, kind of gathering data from wherever you are. I love bio blitzes too, that a lot of big parks sponsor, where you can come in for a weekend and work with people who will help you figure out what you're seeing or give you tools like microscopes. You bring your samples back to a tent and they help you identify it and you get your name on whatever that thing was. And it's a family activity too. But I think it's a lot to expect parents who might not have had these experiences themselves. I mean, even if they put an ultraviolet flashlight in their kid's hand and went out and wandered around to see if they could find, what glows and what do you think that's showing you, whether it's deer pee, whether it's a piece of moss that fluoresces for some reason. There's just got to be a purpose and a way in for these, what they are really gatekeepers to the forest, your parents.
I know, and I kind of think one of the best things we can do as parents is actually to get lost and not be totally freaked out about it. You know what I mean? Like it's not that we have all the knowledge. It's that we can accept the fact that we don't have all the knowledge and still feel okay about that and transfer that confidence to our children.
Sure.
So it sounds like there's a huge potential here to dig in deeper. I'd love to do the same session with someone from Teachers College or with some of my friends who are teachers, science teachers in urban areas to see if we can brainstorm forward into capturing some of these key moments in ways that can resonate in classrooms. That's the next step, is how do you, or for parents, how do you make it easy? How do you enable that possibility? It can be in a park, in a city. It doesn't have to be, in the natural world as we used to think of it. This has been a wonderful session, guys. We'll call it to a close here and just think about ways to do more. I'm glad. I think most of you had not met each other before.
No.
So that means
I have, according to Paul.
yeah, I like to make these conversations, iterative. So let's find a way to dig in on some particular question and take it forward a little further.
Great.
Bring in someone else and make some progress. To sustain what is a global online conversation, identifying solutions to complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges attending humanity's great acceleration, including our great digitization, which is what we've been talking about today. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the way we're all connecting right now today. But as we know, it's full of distraction, it's full of confusion, it's full of manufactured disinformation, and it's a system that can do wonderful things and also terrible things. At the Earth Institute of Columbia University, I'm building an initiative trying to make the best of this capacity. And this is part of that experiment, the Monday sessions here called Thriving Online. As soon as we're done here, share the link you've been watching on with friends and neighbors and get in touch with me with ideas, looking at that distracting scrolling bar at the bottom that has information on how to find me. That's my Cooper's Hawk. And thank you for being here today, especially the folks on the call, Paul Greenberg, Angelica Patterson at the Earth Institute, Columbia University, and at Black Rock Forest, Richard Louv, Children in Nature Network, and author of a great new book, which we'll talk about maybe another day, Our Wild Calling. Maybe let's do that. We'll do another, let's dig in on your book. And Karen Romano-Young, who's been on here twice now. I can't get enough of your doodle bugging. Maybe it's because I need it.
Thank you.
Life. So thanks for being here. I'm
Thanks,
just going to show you on Wednesday. Let's see if this works. Yeah, oops, sorry. So this Wednesday, we're digging in deeper on another big issue, my 35 years of climate reporting. We're focusing on the managed retreat part. There's parts of this planet that simply we have to understand are going to go underwater or are going to become very hot in ways that might be marginally livable. So how do we normalize building the capacity in communities to design for change, to design for a sea level that won't ever be a normal sea level again? Here at Columbia next summer in June, we're having a second meeting on managed retreat. It's going to be a great session with some really important thinkers and scholars and scientists on that front. And that's it for today. Thank you again, everybody, and stay
Thank
well.
you.
Bye,
Connect,
thank you.
get
Thank
out
you.
there, get out into the snow. Those of you who are in my climate, and be well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.